Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me. I feel so honored. I've been teaching Bread Givers for the last 10 years, and I teach it repeatedly because my students are all new immigrants when they first come to our school. I teach at Brooklyn International High School, and our students are from 30 different countries from around the world. And when they first come to our school in 9th grade, many of them don't speak English. When I get them in 12th grade, they are just making those steps then to applying to college and making the transition, just like Sarah in Bread Givers, from making their home in New York City and now moving beyond New York City or staying in New York City and going into college. I was thinking about, I asked my students today, how do you connect to this book? What is it? Do you see any similarities, or do you find that the obstacles in the book are similar for immigrants today? And here's a quote that was read today in class. We did a reader's theater with the first chapter today. And the quote is on the first page, where Sarah says, "I was about 10 years old then, but from always it was heavy on my heart, the worries for the house, as if I was mother." And I find that a lot of our students have this great responsibility today and then of not only being children of immigrants, but also having the big responsibility of being the primary translator in the house. They're the ones who learn English the fastest. They're the ones who take a day off of school to go to the doctor with their families. They're the ones who take a day off of school to talk to the rent collector. They're the ones who take a day off of school to sit in the office of someone in New York that will help them pay for food stamps or get food stamps, or someone who will help them with housing. So they have these big, big responsibilities that Sarah also has. Yet they're also finding their own voice within that, and I think that's remarkable. I feel an immense amount of awe for my students, as I do for Sarah, because they're taking on the role of adult as well as navigating this new culture that they've come into. So it's incredibly, I'm just inspired by them always. And then what happens is that I ask the students, and they of course also get very upset with the father. They also are trying to balance their own Americanization with their families. And today we talked a little bit about acculturation and how families have, older members of the family have a different trajectory of acculturation than do the students. And that often causes conflict. The students are rapidly becoming Americanized, whereas the families are not as rapidly becoming Americanized. And that causes conflict because the expectations are different at home than they are outside and in school. So that is a course of conflict. But one of the things at the end, as I'm teaching the book, I'm always asking the students, would you leave the father? Do you think that Sarah, it's okay that Sarah wants to have her own life? And many of them often say, no, it's not, because family comes first. Doesn't matter who your family is, doesn't matter what they do or what they say, but they're the ones who come first. And I really feel like this last part really resonates with them and with me. I'm also the child of an immigrant. My parents, my sister's right here, my sister and I, we grew up in Indiana. Our parents came for college. They came from Burma and Bangladesh. We're of Indian ethnicity. Both my sister and I were born here in the United States, but we also, I think we also carry that burden of culture and of the generation before us. And I just want to read this and then I'll stop because all these people have a lot more to say than I do. And this quote, I think, resonates well with my students as well. At the end, I suddenly realized that I'd come back to where I had started 20 years ago when I began my fight for freedom. But my rebellious youth, I thought, could escape by running away. And now I realize that the shadow of the burden was always following me. And here I stood face to face with it again. And it's that idea that you can run away, but your culture, your traditions are part of who you are, and that you cannot separate yourself from that. So I think that that's something that I see in myself and my students, and that's something that keeps me coming back to this book. Sarah is finding her own voice and coming back, I think, and it's that stays with me. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to say first that I'm really happy to be back here again tonight talking about Anzia, and I've actually even done that before, so some of you may find yourself in familiar turf. But I also want to say that it's a special pleasure to be back here on an evening when we, all of us, no matter where we come from, are once again caught in a cycle of immigration, refugee status, hatred, fear, all of those things which have been with us throughout American history, but which seem now to have coalesced again in a particularly harsh way and a particularly harsh moment. So it's wonderful that the museum is sponsoring this program right now, but I mean, I know you didn't mean it to be right now, but so thank you. I thought what I should do is talk a little bit about the beginnings of the rebirth of Bread Givers and how it came back into print again, because that's a story that's part of Anzia's own story in a way. Well, let me just tell you what the story was. So I'm an immigrant, like many of you in this room. And part of what I was doing as an immigrant at some point, I come from a World War II refugee family, so I've had all that experience. But when I entered graduate school, I decided I would do a dissertation on Jewish immigrant history. Not for any particular reason, except that I had languages that other people didn't have. I was an American historian. I thought this would be an interesting way to find out not about the past of my own family, but about the past of the greater community from which they came. So I did most of my research in the New York Public Library, reading Yiddish microfilm in the basement of the library. In those days, nothing was digitized. And Yiddish microfilm, right? You can imagine, if you're old enough, what those machines look like. It makes you completely crazy. English microfilm makes you crazy, but Yiddish microfilm makes you even crazier. And in the course of doing this dissertation, which was about labor and immigration in the late 19th century, I came across Anzia Yezierska, whose first stories were published in 1915 and the years after that, and whose first books were published in the early part of the 1920s. Now, she had nothing to do with my dissertation, but here were these books I'd encountered, by novels, no less, by a Jewish woman, immigrant writer, and I was tired of Jewish men, labor leaders. So every day at 4:30, an hour before I had to go home, I would go upstairs from the downstairs newspaper room and find one of Yezierska's books. In those days, the New York Public Library actually had books on the shelves instead of no books. And that way, I read through the entire corpus of Anzia Yezierska's books. It's not so big. There are 6 novels and a collection of short stories, a couple of collections of short stories. And you got it? Okay, good. And all of the short stories resonate with the same kind of emotional fervor that Anzia Yezierska did. So I read the books as a Jewish immigrant woman who was writing a dissertation on immigration, which was perforce in those days about men, not about women. And the books hit me. They resonated with a force that nothing else that I was reading resonated with. So when I finished reading the last book, I was devastated. And I thought to myself, well, which is the best book? And I went back to the librarian and I said, how much would it cost to reproduce a copy of Bread Givers? Well, this is the first edition that came out. In those days, there were no Xerox machines. I know I'm giving away age, but there were no Xerox machines. And finally, after a week or so of looking around, I was told that I could have the book off-printed, that is, done by a printing process, for $57.20. And $57.20 was a lot of money in those days for a graduate student, but I really wanted the book. So I got myself a copy of Bread Givers. I had then a copy. And for about 5 years, I literally carried it around with me. I thought, this book should be reprinted. Other people should read this book. And every publisher, every editor I turned to, they would read it, they would laugh, they would say it's sentimental, it's melodramatic, it's not really a very good novel, she doesn't write very clearly, she's got all that Yiddish stuff in it. And then one day I encountered a young woman who was the child of immigrants and who happened to be married to an editor. And Karen Braziller, who was the daughter-in-law of she was married to Michael Braziller and the daughter-in-law of George Braziller, who owned what was then a rather well-known art history publishing house. Karen persuaded her father-in-law to publish this book for no reason other than that Karen wanted the book. And we both thought, well, that was nice. Okay, it was now in print. What would it do? And then within a year of publication, we realized that the book had taken off. It just had soared. We couldn't figure it out. We said, well, by then it was the early 1970s, and the issue of ethnicity was everywhere. In the 60s, it hadn't been everywhere, but in the 70s, it was everywhere. By the 70s, there was the grandchild generation searching for its grandparents. So these were no longer the children of immigrants buying the book, but the grandchildren of immigrants buying the book. And there were people for whom the Lower East Side, the area in which Yezierska lived and in which we are now located, was itself an area of romantic memory, not an area of really hard poverty. It was then the most densely populated area in the world in the first decade of the 20th century. The book, I quickly realized, had transcended everything that I had expected from it. And my expectations were not low. So when I thought about why the book appealed to me so much, what it was that the book was saying, I came up with several phenomena, I think. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about 4 of them. The first, of course, was immigration, that we had already by the early 70s, the mid-70s, we had several accounts of male immigration. We had Abraham Cahan's books. We had Michael Gold. We had the early Henry Roth, Call It Sleep. But we didn't have an account of women's immigration to the Lower East Side. And there was a piece of me even then when there was no women's history, there was only history and it didn't have many women in it at all. But there was a piece of me then by the early 1970s when women's history was beginning to emerge from the cracks that said, there is something this woman is telling us that we're not learning from any of the other immigrant material that I've read. So that was the first thing that appealed to me, that it resonated as a woman, as a female immigrant. The second thing was the discussion of poverty. I mean, here was a book which, unlike the male books, which used poverty as a kind of background, it was something out of which the males came and which they very quickly transcended. So those biographies tend to be biographies of how I, climbed my way up the ladder, overcame the obstacles. But the first half, 2/3 of Bread Givers, is really about what poverty means. What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean in terms of how you live, in terms of sharing the one toothbrush in the household, in terms of taking the room where your father prays or studies, the only private room in the house, and turning it over to boarders, of making a bed with a borrowed feather bed because your own family had left its feather beds back in the old country. And then, of course, what did it mean in terms of the kind of work you could do, you did do, you couldn't do, you weren't accessible for, you were too thin, too weak, too whatever it was to do those jobs. So that was the second experience. I said before, my family was a refugee family, and for many years it lived in abject poverty. Not through anybody's fault, but those were the circumstances that the family faced. And reading about those circumstances and recognizing that generations of immigrants had gone through that process was something that resonated with me. The third thing that resonated was the family. Now, we've already heard a little bit about family and family structure. For me, ironically, it wasn't the autocracy of that patriarchal father, and those of you who've only read a third of the book will see much more of him as the book opens up. He's really a cruel person in a lot of ways. And cruel not by his own lights, not intentionally, but by the lights of those whose lives he creates and shatters in many ways. So a father who imposes marriages, a father who can't on his daughters, a father who cannot listen to his daughters, a father who does not believe daughters are worth listening to, that wives don't have a place in heaven unless they're there to wait upon their husbands. That sense of what a family meant, a patriarchal family, hit me not necessarily because it was so autocratic, but because in my experience, that's the way families were, willy-nilly. Not necessarily because there was a cruel or patriarchal father, but because often economic circumstance and social circumstance and isolation or the desire not to be isolated in a particular community imposed a value structure and a way of being that influenced the entire family group and led them, unless you were a rebel like Anzia, and led that group to follow in the footsteps of a father. So here you might say the father is something of a caricature, and perhaps he is a little bit of a caricature. But that caricature has the grain of truth that caricatures have in them. And that was the piece that, what damage it does to individual desire, to an individual sense of self, to belong to a family unit which is itself controlling. The fourth thing I thought I would get that resonated with me was the thing I so have always loved about Anzia Yezierska. From the time she's a 10-year-old kid, when we meet her, she wants to make herself for a person. And she believes that if she can just be a person, then she can be a real American. A real American. An American who's a self-made American. An American just like a boy American. That is, that she can have some control over her life. That she can move her life to a place where it's satisfying and she's doing work that she cares about. It's not just about moving out of poverty, and indeed, I don't think I'm giving away much in the way of secrets to say that she moves back to the Lower East Side at the end of both at the end of her life and at the end of the book, Bread Givers. But she moves back knowing and understanding that she herself has now become a mediator. She may still be an immigrant, but she has become an American immigrant. She's entitled to, I suppose, what we would now call hyphenation. So that's where I was. I thought that that's what the book would do and that it would appeal to Jewish audiences. And lo and behold, it started to appeal to everybody else. And realizing that those themes that had struck me were not mine alone, but were mine in the context of, a world in which, or different communities in which different, people had grown up, makes me, it drives me to tears sometimes. I think, here's this little Jewish kid who comes from nowhere and who knows nothing, and suddenly she can write something with really a universal kind of appeal. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to forswear the pleasure of telling you anecdotes about Anzia, but I promise I'll tell you some if you ask questions later.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I was saying thank you in a questioning voice because I wasn't sure if the microphone was on, but thank you in a declarative way, emphatically. But what I asked our panelists to do is kind of start out by selecting a scene that spoke to them. And it could speak to them as an individual, and I want to hear about that. And I also want to hear it to the extent that it speaks to you as a member of some kind of community, however you define that, as a feminist, as the job that you have, particular immigrant group, however. So I thought we'd start. Does anyone want to start out first? I have to call on someone. Margaret, do you want to go?
Yeah, so as Annie mentioned before, I wrote a book about garment workers in New York City. And my book has to do with my life, too. It was my PhD dissertation, and it was about my mother as a garment worker. And it talked about Chinese women as garment workers. So that was a big part of the story. But as reading through this book, I noticed that garment work, or cloak and shirt manufacturing, however you want to call it, was a big part of their lives as well. It's not talked about specifically in one particular scene, but we hear about it through the works that different people do. We know that Bessie probably worked in the garment factory. She wanted to marry somebody who wanted to open and move up in his life as an owner of a garment factory. We know that Fania was married off to a cloak and shirt manufacturer. We know that Masha, right? Masha sewed in wealthier persons' homes. She hemmed things and she learned to sew. She might have worked in a garment factory. I don't know. But the theme of garment work runs through the story. And I feel like for immigrants, that garment work is very important in terms of survival, and is also very important for a group of them for upward mobility, as we can see with Fania, right? She moved off to California, did very well, and we see that that's what Beryl wanted to do, right? I got all the names right? Bessie and Beryl, right? Beryl was the man, right? Beryl was the man who wanted to marry Bessie, right? So it's a theme of upward mobility that I think that many times when we think about garment work, we oftentimes think about sweatshops, which it is, but we also have to think about it as also a means, a way of moving up in their lives too. It's a way of access, especially for immigrants at that time, and even for immigrants, during the 1990s and up to the 2000s here, and in particular the Chinese and Latinos here in New York City. So that kind of struck me, and I saw that clearly through the early turn of the century. And the other part that struck me that, and I want to touch about, and Alice mentioned it, it's poverty. For the Chinese immigrants, and people don't see this in the stories that's written in the newspapers and the books that's written about them, but there are families that do live in poverty. And some of the scenes where they talk about in the very beginning where they don't have any fun, all they do is work. And they can't think of anything but work. I see that with many of the families that I've interviewed. When you ask them, where do you go for fun? What do you do? Some of the kids might mention things, but most of the kids sometimes will just say, well, after school, I just go to the garment factory to work, just like here. And the money goes to their families. I have a classmate that I know in particular who spent her whole high school years working in the garment factory, going to school at Stuyvesant. And then after school, going to work in the garment factories and giving the money directly to the parents. She didn't leave for college. Her parents didn't want her to go away. She stayed in New York City. She still lives on the Lower East Side, near her parents, because she still gives them money. But she herself is a professional now. But that's a theme that even runs through to this day in 2015 with many of the Chinese immigrants who came here with very little. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's on. Okay. So I'm going to confess, I read this book in one sitting, and I read it yesterday because I was being a very big procrastinator, and I just devoured it. I was up very late, and the first thing I felt, and the thing I felt throughout the book, was just a lot of anger. I was really upset by the father. I do think that he may be a bit of a caricature now that I have 12 hours distance, and he's kind of a cartoonish character. But I was really, really upset by him, and there are themes in the book that I wouldn't say they don't resonate with me, but I don't have any personal experience with them. Like, for example, the immigrant experience. My parents are not immigrants. I did not grow up in an environment where there were a lot of immigrants. I grew up in Northern California in a college town. Everyone was, white, been there for a while. And so as fascinated as I am by stories about the immigrant experience, I didn't have that connection. What I did have a connection to was being the daughter, or being a daughter or a child in a family that struggled economically, not as badly as Sarah's family does, and making something of oneself where you can give back to your parents as you get older, and being kind of, Sarah's conflicted about it because her father is a bit of a monster. My conflict comes from just not knowing if my parents want that sort of help, but the bigger issue in the book, and the one that the reason I was so angry with the father, is just the depiction of a patriarchal, not just a family, but a society in which women are valued for youth mainly. There's a section in the second chapter where Sarah's mother is talking about what it was like in the old world in Poland, and talking about how she was a great beauty. She'd been lusted after. I don't think she used that word, but was a great dancer, and she had a significant dowry. And she also talks about things like the material goods that she had access to and how much she loved them and missed them. But it really struck me that when she was thinking about her youth, she was not thinking about her youth in terms of, I had more energy or I had a certain amount of freedom, but I was considered to be that she was considered to be desired, or that she was desired. And even today, that's a lot of it's a lot of what women are taught, that their primary value comes in how desired they are by men, that they should derive their value from whether they have a relationship. I loved that Sarah was like, I don't want to get married. I mean, and I don't blame her. I mean, look at what happened to her to her sisters, what her father had done to her sisters. So I think that's what spoke to me the most was Sarah's stubbornness and her belief that she could be a person without a man. At the end, and I'm sorry, I know there's students here who haven't finished it, but she seems to meet a gentleman who she's very close with. I mean, I don't know the exact nature of their relationship, but he sent her roses, so I'm going to assume that it was romantic. But you don't feel at that point in the book that she's given in to you get the sense that she became a whole person, and then she met someone who could be her equal, which was really striking. And the other thing with regards to relationships, and I'm just thinking about this recently because I wrote something about the Jane Austen novel Emma for the Times Book Review. It's the 200th anniversary. And one thing that struck me about that book and what struck me about Sarah in this book is that both characters are very aware, Sarah more so, of, I'll put it this way, I think oftentimes young women, or maybe even older women, when thinking about romantic relationships, always wonder whether the man likes them. Does he like me? And they try to put themselves into contortions to make themselves more desirable. They rarely ask, at least when I was younger, my friends and I, we rarely asked whether we liked the guy. Was he worthy of us? Was he actually interesting? Did he actually have something to say? Did he have to ask questions? And when Sarah's being courted by I'm forgetting his name, Max? Is it Max, the guy who her sister has sent from LA? She remarks a number of times that he displays no curiosity about her. And even when she's reading to him and she thinks that he's involved in listening to her, read to him, the thing he says when she finishes is he says something about how he's going to do a great deal, or he's going to double his money. I mean, he's obviously he doesn't have any interest in her. He sees her as an object.
And she's able to comment on that by saying
Yes.
something about how to ask him a question about himself or to ask him to talk about himself was like inviting him to a feast.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever met anyone like that?
Yeah.
Ever?
So, I'm not trying to say that all men are like that, but let me just say that it is something that resonates even today, and that I do think that a lot of young women that I know could push themselves more to ask themselves whether they like a potential romantic partner, not whether he likes them. And I'm being very heteronormative here. I'm talking about heterosexual relationships, but I really loved that particular scene because it felt like she was learning more about herself and what she wanted, and the fact that she spent so much time alone studying. I mean, it really. There's something to be said, and I think that especially in this era when we're kind of constantly on our devices and obsessed with being in contact with people, there's something to be said for being alone and the kind of nourishment that one can get, spending time alone with the things that one loves, and I just that very much resonated with me. So
yeah, and I think there is this tension in the book, and I shouldn't jump in, but I just have to. But the way there's both that desire to make of herself a person that you hear throughout, and then she says she has, in order to get married first, to marry a man who is a person, she has to make of herself a person. And it comes a couple times. But then she also said her greatest need is that she loves to be loved. And then how those, and is it a conflict, or is there a way to balance that? I think is this.
I don't know if I believed her, though, that it was her greatest need, because it seemed like her greatest need was self-knowledge. It seemed like her greatest need was the education of herself and the finding of herself. So when she said that, I was like, well, I understand that, but I actually don't think that's true.
Or maybe she feels that in some mood. And there's something about this book, why I love this book, and then I will be quiet because I'm not supposed to talk yet, but why I love this book, too, is the emotions in it. I feel like we spend so much time in our societies where we're supposed to hide our emotions, or to be a good business person, you're not supposed to have your face show everything you think, or be able to respond all this way. And so to read this, or we're supposed to lean in and be like men in order to succeed. Mm-hmm. A great book in many ways, but anyways. But in this book, it's all about jumping forward and being who you are, when that hour is, with the right to change your mind and your emotion too, which is.
Hold on, though. Because, of course, what characterizes her when she makes the transition is the navy blue simple dress. She's got this dress that's like a nun's dress, I get. It's very simple, and she wants a quiet room with white furniture and nothing in it. So yes, she may want to be loved, but she also wants to be by herself. She wants to be her own person.
But when she's wearing that navy dress, she still makes a fool of herself by going after the professor and acting in ways that aren't. But yes, and she loses him. Yes, but Linda.
So So I am a child of Palestinian immigrants, and my parents came from a very small village on the border of Ramallah called Al-Bida, and they came here in the 1970s. They literally came from a village in Al-Bida, and they came to another village here in Brooklyn, and they literally lived around the same people that were from the same village as them. And my parents taught me a Palestinian dialect that they don't even speak in my village anymore, that I can still speak here in Brooklyn. And I was the oldest of 7 children, and when I was 10 years old, I was already the oldest of 7 children living in Brooklyn in a 2-bedroom apartment. My dad, we were a little more fortunate in the sense that my dad had his brother already here, so we had a little bit of some support that other immigrant families unfortunately don't have. And many things resonate with me in this book. I think the idea and people understanding the difference between, for example, what I call Muslim culture, Jewish culture versus religion. Like, nothing in my religion says I have to be in an arranged marriage, right? Like, that's just not part of my religion. But the culture that I grew up, that is my culture. So while this was written, while this happened, I don't know, 1900, I got married in Brooklyn, New York in 1997 in an arranged marriage right here in New York City. It was something that my parents grew up believing, or they were taught that, you were suited for someone, that it wasn't that you just went out there and found someone that you loved and it didn't matter what they worked or how they were, there was a couple of criteria, and it was the idea of putting your daughter into the hands of stability, that you weren't going to let your daughter just go out there and make her own bad choices, that your parents had their best interest in you. And as someone who myself, I would say of all of my sisters, my parents don't need to know this, so don't tweet this part out. But 4 of my sisters, so I got married in an arranged marriage, but my sisters, so we were 5 in a row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 daughters. So I got arranged in a marriage to a Palestinian immigrant who had just come here to the United States, and my sisters, number 2 to 5, were like, that ain't happening to me. So what they did was that they orchestrated arranged marriages. So they did whatever they needed to do, and they hooked it up, and this one called that one, and it made it sound like it was like someone saw them at a wedding somewhere, when in fact you've known him for I don't know how many years. But that's not the point. The point is that this really resonated with me as someone who was the oldest child, who kind of was stuck in this kind of cultural, you don't say no to your parents. I didn't think my dad was a patriarchal, I thought my dad loved me very much. He made sure I had everything that I needed. Very compassionate father, and continues to be. My mom was worried about everything and anything. My dad actually didn't worry as much as my mother. He kind of thought that everything was set out. My mom would worry about everything. And I connected a lot to the characters, because to me, when you read this book, you get angry at that dad. I loved my dad, and if you were living in my house, you'd probably be quite angry at my father too. But I knew that my dad was looking out for me, and it was part of the culture that they grew up in. This is all that they knew. And who was I, who was only a first generation in Brooklyn, living in a community that was just like me, right? So I went to public school, so I was around other kids during the day, and I met people that were Latino, and I had a huge Asian community. I'm from Sunset Park. But I grew up, but after school and on the weekends, my community was my community. So nothing was abnormal to me. I didn't think that I was different than anybody else, because it was happening. Other people were talking about arranged marriage. Our immigrant parents, my dad was working from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. So did my friends' fathers. I didn't feel out of the ordinary until I grew up and went out into the world. And I was like, well, maybe that wasn't that very normal. And then now I have my own children. And just, reading this and thinking about my own life and thinking, would I do that to my children? And I think, that I didn't get to do what my sisters did, but I get to kind of do that for my own kids now. So for me, it skipped a generation of thinking about what does it mean to be an American, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what that means too, because I feel like there is nothing that's actually American, but this idea of culture and what people bring with them here and what they want to hold on to, and this idea of marriage, like what does that actually mean? Like for my mom, one time I told my mom, I said, wait a minute, here in the, they marry for love. My mom's like, love? She's like, the minute they get married, they get divorced here. This is what happens. And I said to my mom, wait a minute, but you've been married to my dad for like 36 years. She said, I just started loving your dad like 4 years ago. And I was like, so for my mom, it was the manifestation of like, she got married, she did the kids thing, gave everybody the grandkids, she took care of all the things that my dad couldn't do. She was like, basically she was my dad's secretary. Like she paid all the bills, she did everything. My dad just worked for 15, 16 hours a day. So the book really spoke to me. I loved every character in it. I just had an understanding with them. I understood where they were all coming from. I had every character in my own family, and I could see why this one was mad. I have my second sister was the most rebellious of us all. She's a mortgage appraiser. She wears like short like skirts. She doesn't wear hijab. Like she's like, this is me, take it or leave it. And other of my sisters were like they took like different levels like of what kind of like how rebellious and out they wanted to be. So just a lot of, to think that this happened 100 years ago and it's still happening like right now is kind of surreal for me.
And especially that point about, the immigration experience is different whether you're a parent or a child. And then I think most people get that, but what they don't always get is that where you fall in the birth order in terms of among the siblings has such an impact, and how old you are when you come over if you come over in a family like that. So this brings that out as well. Nisha, you're last, and then
last,
but not least.
So the section I wanted to talk about is the sort of opening of book 2, and it stood out for me for a couple of reasons. So I loved the fact that it opened with her sort of dreaming in a way, right, of becoming a teacher, and this sort of yearning that she has for herself and for what she wants for her future. And then it sort of moves immediately to, I need to get a job, and she goes to the ironer, and they say, no, we need a big burly woman to do this job, and this sort of immediate juxtaposition between yearning and challenges, right? She tries to get a room of her own and has many people say, oh, you're such a princess. That sort of dynamic, I think. It occurred to me that is probably true. The yearning and the challenge and the sort of struggle of that is true of every single immigrant. I actually can't imagine that that's not true for really any immigrant coming to a new country. And I liked the way that at least it was presented here in the book. The other piece that I absolutely loved in this section was just her desire to be alone. And, she opens the window and all this dirt gets dropped on her, and but it's still wonderful. And she just wants her own space. She wants to be alone. And I thought that was powerful for a couple of reasons. One was this point about poverty. And for me, my sort of exposure to poverty came by almost going backwards to my parents' home country in India. And when I was in college, I decided to have a trip to find myself and discover my roots, and I wrote for a travel guide in India. And I was writing for these, going in budget locations, walking around with my backpack, and just realizing the physicality of poverty in a place like India. And it was a light that turned on for me that was completely foreign to my own experience, where I, lived in I had a very comfortable upbringing. And so I think that the physicality of that somehow, and her wanting to be alone, I think really symbolized that, was symbolized here in that way for me. The other thing that I loved about it was there was something about her as a woman wanting to be alone and finding herself as a person that I think was captured in that. And it made me think about my own mother, who was a rebellious hippie activist in India who never wanted to get married. And, my favorite picture of her is in her bell-bottoms standing in front of a tree making a peace sign, And she did have an arranged marriage, right, because of her relationship to her father. And not only did she have an arranged marriage, she got married to a guy who brought her to the United States with really nobody that she knew. And suddenly this woman who didn't want to get married, who was an activist, has me and is like in Camden, New Jersey, sort of trying to make her way. And there was something about the courage but she's always said, sort of in raising me, you need to be your own person. You need to find a space of your own. And I think there's something about that really sort of jumped out at me, the courage it takes, I think, especially as a woman, to say, here I am, I'm going to be alone just to read a book, to turn off the noise, to sort of create my own sort of space. And I feel grateful for learning that from my own mother, and I sort of really, it really jumped out for me in the text in that way too.
So I want to go back to something that Linda had brought up about what does it mean to be American, right? And what does it mean to be American in this book? I think there are different ways we see that. There's one vision of being American, which is Max, who is only thinking about business, always thinking about business. That's why he wants to. That's how he gets forward. And there's a lot of people who view business as their route to being American. I think Sarah, in some ways, has the idea, education is what is going to make her American, studying education. And the father is really complicated, too, because he, at one point, says he's going to open up his own business. He wants to actually marry off one of his daughters in order to get the money, extract the money from the guy to open up his own business. And the wife is like, why would you do this? You have no head for business. You should study. Why don't you become a rabbi in a synagogue? Because he is a scholar, and this is what he does. But what he says at that point was, I don't want to do that. What? Sell my religion for money? Become a false prophet to the Americanized Jews? No. My religion is not for sale. I only want to go into business so as to keep sacred my religion. So again, it's almost as if the business religion, which was his own identity, had to be different from business and becoming and being an American. But so I feel like there's all these different ways that people are struggling with what it means to be an American. And I guess my question is I'll get to a question at some point or other, but what do you think, what did Sarah think being an American meant? Or what did Anzia?
I can start maybe by talking a little bit about Anzia and what she thought. And really that's much more evident in the short stories she wrote than in the book. So if you can get hold of a collection of short stories called Hungry Hearts, or a collection I put together called The Open Cage, she was in many ways a much better craftsperson as a short story writer, because in each of her short stories she takes one of the longings and shows the ways in which it gets transformed or turned on its head. So, for example, the John Dewey figure, the professor in here who she's in love with and who rejects her, is based on a real romance that she had with, or a hoped-for romance with John Dewey when he was teaching at Teachers College, and she, Anzia, enrolled in Teachers College and had a real crush on him, which he could not, he had a relationship with her, but he never returned her. He was put off by her passion. Mm-hmm. And so there she talks about being in America means being cool-headed, mm-hmm. being distant from your emotions, being able to control your emotions. So none of these loud noises, those loud noises are too colorful for... So, and in part, that's the story she's telling here. It's only when she can learn how to control herself that she can be an American. I'm not sure that that's my definition of being an American or most other people's. There are other places where she talks about just getting out of poverty. So there's a wonderful story in which she talks about the children of a Lower East Side resident becoming successful, and her son and daughter rent a big apartment on Riverside Drive and move the immigrant up to Riverside Drive. And there she's sitting on Riverside Drive, and there's no community. There's no people. When she carries her packages in through the front door, the doorman laughs at her. And when she cooks something in the kitchen, the children turn up their noses at the smell. And so she is, as the children keep saying her, you know, this is what you wanted in America. This is, and she says finally, no, this is not my America. And she moves back to the Lower East Side. So I don't think there's an answer to your question. I think there are many different answers to what it means to be an American.
I was going to say, but I do think she talks about, what it means to be a hyphenated American, though, because I think she wants some of the, you know, she wants to move out of poverty. She wants a room of her own. She wants space, because poverty here means living in a 2-room apartment for most people, right? So she wants a room of her own, but she wants to also live around her community. So that's why she moves back home. So I think for her, to be able to accept where her family comes from, to be able to accept and know that there's poverty around her is okay, and she will try her best to also move on as American as she can, and to have that room, to have money, and also to spend too, I think on the community.
That's surely the paradox, or a piece of the paradox. It's once you absolutely need to get out of poverty, but once you're out of poverty, then what have you lost?
That's right.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a great point where the family at one point moves to Elizabeth, New Jersey to take over a store, and it was a big disaster. And she couldn't wait to get back to the Lower East Side. And at a certain point, after a fight with her father, did that, picked up her stuff and moved back to the Lower East Side. And that's when she's searching for a room. And she says, I wanted back and so, you know, have you ever, you know, as much as you hate New York sometimes, right? We all hate New York. And then you leave New York, and then you can't wait to get back. Has anyone? So she says, I wanted back the mornings going to work and the evenings from work, the crowd sweeping you on like waves of a beating sea, the shop, the roar of the rushing machines, the drive and thrill of doing things faster and faster, the pay envelope, the joyous feel of money where every little penny was earned with your own hands. And that, I don't read that as like a capitalist love or something, but the idea that through New York and through her community here and through the garment shop, going back to something you said earlier, she's able to become an individual in a strange way, which is, this, again, another paradox. Working in a shop, which is monotonous, and there's a boss, but there's that work that actually gives an individual and a family some kind of independence. And in our interviews with families who lived in this very building in the 70s and 80s, the mother said she went to the shop, and she also was in an arranged marriage, and you know, going to the shop, she loved. I mean, you know, like she loved every second of it. But that was, she earned money, and with that money, it was what she could do with that money, which was sending for her siblings to come over and helping them out. And so, there's something about that drive and that independence and what work can give people that I saw through the book as well.
And I think to read the book right now, it's such a good like world context, or maybe national context to read it in, because I think everyone comes here and decides what it is to be an American. Like my father has a very different perspective of what it means to be an American versus someone who's maybe more indigenous, or someone who's been here for 3, 4, 5 generations. And I think right now what we do as Americans, or at least some Americans do this, is where they want to impose this idea of what an American is. And right now we're having a big national discussion about like, are American Muslims American? Is Islam an American religion? Can people consider it to be part of a fabric of this nation? And we're having very bad conversations about how it's not, and how it's foreign, and how people formulate in their mind what does it look like to be something, right, that represents who they are, without understanding that a place like the United States of America there should never be, and if there is one, I'm out of here. If there is one definition of what it means to be an American, because then we wouldn't be the United States of America. So I think reading this book and just thinking about the conversations, and even some of the more internal kind of of who you are and where you want to go is so different for everyone. But right now we're living in a country in 2015 where we're actually telling you, let me tell you what an American is, and this is why you don't fit that, versus we're having these conversations like 250 years ago, right? So it's the book for me right now was like on that level was, not difficult to read, but it just comes from a different perspective when you're reading something at a particular time.
I also think sort of this idea, right, of the tension and of the movement, I think is the point, right? I think that's sort of the point of America. It's the point of immigrants. It's this yearning that then comes against the challenge that actually is the friction that moves things forward. And I do think that's pretty American, especially sort of in my work in talking to folks internationally about immigration, where in many parts of the world you can be a third-generation Turk living in Germany, and you're still not considered German. And I don't feel that way at all, being sort of the next generation of Indian-American here. And I think that's something that is unique to us, and I think it's something about the movement, and there's something about all of us sort of being drawn both to the root, whether it's New York City, I leave and I definitely come back, and I'm very excited to be back here, even though there are plenty of times when I hate it. And then I think that sort of to what Linda was saying around the questions of sort of what it means to be an American, I think that is what's scary about our time right now, is that we're almost trying to go to this place where we want to be stuck. And we want to be stuck in a particular vision. And I think that's why it feels so anti-American, because we're just not about being stuck. And that's sort of what moves this book, but it's also what moves the country and the city. And so I think there's something about the movement that's almost being American.
I think I'm more pessimistic than a lot of people on the panel, because I feel like right now that, well, and I felt this for a long time, like if you take the phrase all American, what you usually think of is like a blonde cheerleader, or it's very rarely that you think of an African American or a Mexican American or an Indian American, like, and that hasn't changed. So I do think there's hopefully movement about what it is to be an American that encompasses a lot of different types of people who look a lot of different types of ways. But I think that phrase is very telling because of what it conjures in the mind and how that relates to a lot of the conversations that are happening now. And I don't even know if I'd call them conversations. I'd call them like tantrums, coming from the right wing. And I feel kind of pessimistic about it, because I would think that we'd be further along than we are. And one interesting thing about the book is that Sarah doesn't get that much feedback from people who aren't immigrants. I mean, she they're the women at the laundry who, to use a modern term, are kind of throwing shade at her. But it's unclear as to whether it's because she's the daughter of immigrants or whether she's just kind of bookish and yeah. And then of course when she's in college and she's kind of coveting she seems to be somewhere in a rural. She seems to be in like a rural area. It's unclear where she is. Maybe New England. And there are lots of young white women who were wearing sweater sets or what have you, and is like coveting maybe their aesthetic, but you don't get a real sense that when they push back against her, especially like in the gym class, or they're laughing at her, that it's because she's an immigrant. It might be because she's shy or withholding or what have you, or maybe all those things are related. Who knows? And that was one thing I wish the book had more of, which is to say more kind of explication about how she and her family were received by the quote-unquote outside world, the world beyond the Lower East Side. They would talk about the outside world. They talk about Fifth Avenue and the shops on Fifth Avenue and all the great dresses and furs and the ways that other people lived. But we didn't really see them interact with people outside the Lower East Side, except for Sarah and except when she went to college.
Well, I mean, that goes back to something Linda was saying earlier too, that for her, most of the people she's interacting with while she's on the way of making herself an American are not American. It's only when she's almost, it's the penultimate success is getting to the college, right? But then there's the new challenge of making it through the college, and that's when but even then, all the Americans that are depicted are very stereotypical, very flat, I guess, very flat. And I've read all of her books, but not for a long time. And so I'm not sure if it's safe to say that many of the Americans portrayed in her corpus have that kind of flat kind of.
That's how she imagines Americans. So the ideal American has no emotions, does not get angry, does not lose his temper, is tall and handsome and male. And ideal American females don't really exist because they are all, one way or the other, undermining of her, even when they're supportive. So they give her scholarships, but then they exact their pound of flesh. I wanted to say that Yezierska herself managed to get a scholarship to Teachers College and became a student and graduated from Teachers College. She never wanted to be a teacher. I mean, she simply didn't. But it was the only place where she could get the scholarship. The city colleges were male in those days. So she gets the scholarship to Teachers College, and she majors in home economics. She couldn't care less about home economics. It's the last thing that she wants to do. And yet there's no piece of her that ever feels as though she's cheating or she's depriving somebody else of it. She feels as though she's so entitled to what America has to give her, that America should be listening to her. And the green campus, that's her imagination. She didn't actually go to a green campus place ever, though her daughter did. And when her daughter went to a green campus school, Yezierska followed her there. The daughter went to the University of Wisconsin, and in the late 1920s, Yezierska actually literally followed her to the University of Wisconsin and rented an apartment there so she could be close to this daughter who she had abandoned when she was 3 years old. And that's another of the paradoxes. She never felt that leaving the daughter with the father, abandoning the daughter essentially, there was anything wrong with that. She believed that she was entitled to push herself, to make herself into an American. And I think that's another of the ways in which it's so difficult. So if a male had done that, you would never say he abandoned his daughter. He just went to college and she took care of the kid. But she is accused of abandoning the daughter. And there's one more story I want to tell, which is the cuts that you're looking at up here are from the restored version of the film that was made in 1920 from Hungry Hearts, which was her first book of published short stories. Now, Anzia, she'd published short stories, she'd won a prize, and then suddenly she publishes this collection of short stories, and that collection of short stories brings her her first taste of fame. She's invited out to Hollywood to help make this film. And she spends about 7 months. She takes the daughter with her. The daughter is, at this point, she was born in 1912, so she's 8 years old. She takes the daughter with her. And then she decides that having the daughter there is cramping her style. So she puts the daughter on a train, that's how you traveled in those days, and sends her back to New York to be with her father by herself on a train. I once asked the daughter whether she remembered this experience, and I got an earful, but I'm telling you about. She was 8. She was 8 when that happened to her, and she said, well, she found somebody to take care of her on the train. But then, about 6 months after that, she decides that Hollywood, which she has at first imagined as the quintessential America, I mean, after all, this was the place where anybody could make it. This was the golden land. She'd finally discovered it. But there aren't any people like her there. there are lots of Jewish immigrants. There are lots of self-made men there, and even some self-made women. But there aren't any products of the tenements that she longs for. And so she goes back to the tenements and sets herself up as an American there because now she's had this experience. So, I find that question very complicated.
Yeah, and in your summary of Anja's description of an American, someone who remains very calm and unruffled, I think we need to talk to Donald Trump and let him know that he does not fit that definition.
He's not an American,
right?
in my judgment.
Yes, exactly. So tweet that, someone. But I want to go back, do a final question, then we want to open it up for questions. Is this, I'll just ask the question without commenting. Is this a feminist book?
Yeah, I think so. I do. I think so. But I believe that it is. I was very upset by the father. I mean, as I said earlier, and I was actually disappointed at the end, and I'm going to spoil stuff, that she kind of went back to him. Like, I actually don't believe that you have to be, that you have to take care of your family at all costs. I think he terrorized those children. He terrorized his daughters. He was a hypocrite and an idiot in some ways, with regards to business at least. And selfish and self-absorbed and nasty and I mean I just I really hated this guy, and so it felt like the book was an indictment not just of men like himself, but like there really aren't that many great men in the book. There's, I guess, the poet that does Bessie fall in love with the poet, or is it? Oh, it's Masha. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
Bessie falls in love with the poet.
Right. So
No, Fania falls in love with
okay.
the poet.
So
Bessie was the sparrow.
I'm mixing them up with my grade. I know. There are a couple of examples of like honorable men in the book, but most of the men in the book are not portrayed as. I mean, it's kind of, it makes men look horrible. But I think that it is in terms of, she's making an indictment, I think, of patriarchy. I think that she's arguing for the importance of aloneness, which we've talked about already, and education, and not to sound trite, following one's dream, and that seems, that might seem kind of common now. It's year 2015, but this was 1925. So even though I wasn't around then, I think that it was probably received as being pretty provocative.
I would agree with that. And I also think she goes back and forth with the paradoxes about dress, too, about how feminine you need to be, and with the lipstick and the makeup and observing what people wear. So I think in there she's having like a conversation of what she kind of thinks what an independent woman ought to be. What you can go back and forth, you can choose, but you might also want to wear the blue dress on occasion, too. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say that the big paradox for me is that in her real life, she didn't go back to her father. In the book, she goes back to her father. So why is it that this woman who struggled so hard to make something of herself, actually in her most successful novel, has to finish it by going back to the father? I know that would be my one question about, is it or isn't it?
So I think this actually goes back to what Shazia said earlier, which is that it's almost symbolic of saying you come back to what you were, right? It's like saying this, yes, I want a room of my own. The father is a caricature, and by putting these things in relief, it almost says, like, this is a part of who I am, and that's in being American, in being whatever it is that she was trying to be, you don't ever actually give away that part. And so I actually don't see it as a paradox. I actually quite relate to it. My father was happily not like this father, but I think that's the piece of it, is there's always, even if you wander very far away from where you came, you end up coming back. And maybe it's too obvious of a metaphor, but I think I didn't know that she didn't end up going back to her father, so that's how I would at least interpret that. And I definitely think it's a feminist book, and it's again in the room of your own, and sort of her willingness, frankly, her bravery at that time in wanting to chart her own path, I think is amazing.
Yeah, I was in there was a book club we actually did at the museum, and there was one woman, I remember, who reacted quite strongly to the end of the book, not to going back to the father, but the fact that there was the love interest at the end, too. And she was so angry about that. And at that point, what I tried to do is understand the context of the time as well. But then in rereading it, I kind of felt like her ability to be able to balance that at that moment, and to be able to think I had to rebel, but in rebelling to do my own thing, I actually took the same characteristics that made my own father do his own thing, right, in that recognition. And it's a beautiful balance, and you don't know what's going to happen in the next chapter, of course, because you don't do this turbulent chapter by chapter, and if you read the next chapter, I'm sure she got in a fight with the father and took off. But there is, but it's such a good point that what she maybe did in this book was something that she wasn't able maybe to do in her own personal life. So let me open it up to questions, and we have a what's it called, a wandering microphone, a free microphone, and we'll be able to up here, right here.
Okay. Because you've made her your life work, you sometimes do a reasonable kind of back and forth between the character and the woman in the book, right? And the woman who wrote it. So she was writing a book, and she was an author trying to sell books. And decisions you make as the author, that this book will go, if she does the right thing, is the good girl, takes care of the father, has the love interest, bingo, we got a book. And I just think the agency of the author and the audience. So, it's not her biography. This is the book she wrote to sell. And so for any author, pieces of who they are there, but there's also the audience.
So I'm going to disillusion everybody now. Of course, you're absolutely right. And when I got to know her daughter, who I didn't get to know until after this was published, but when I got to know the daughter, Louise Levitas, and I started to talk to her about how Anzia worked, she told me the following. She said that Louise, so she was born in 1912. So her mother had already written several books, but she was about 12 or 14 years old when her mother reached her peak. She would, at that point in her life, go visit her mother. Her mother would ask her to come and visit her on occasional weekends. And why she wanted her to visit her was so she, the daughter, could tell her what in America would be an appropriate ending or an appropriate story or an appropriate... So Louise told me a dozen stories about how, Anzia had sat with her and said, I want you to read this and see if it really sounds real or doesn't sound real. And then she would say yes or no, and Anzia would yell at her and throw her out and then rewrite the piece or the book. I mean, yeah. What can I say? But yes, it's meant to be sold. And she was always very conscious of the selling.
But she was very upset when they made Hungry Hearts and there was a happy ending with the movie, and she didn't want that to be. So it's interesting how that could be.
Hi, thank you. The copy that I have of Bread Givers, which I guess I got in the early 1990s, has the introduction by you. And I was just wondering if that introduction was included initially when the book was republished. Is that so? The book, when you had it, or when you were able to get it republished, it had your introduction, and it sort of has stayed the same since then.
The introduction has stayed the same, and for the second edition, I wrote an afterword. So there are some copies that have the afterword in it, and for the third edition, I not only wrote an afterword, but Louise, the daughter, wrote something too. So yes, but that initial introduction is the original introduction.
1975.
1975. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
With regard to the question of the American identity, you mentioned that you first discovered her reading in Yiddish. Did she write in English and was translated into Yiddish, or what's the publication history a little bit?
No. She when she wrote, which she did occasionally, nonfiction stuff, book reviews and so on, she wrote in English. She wrote a beautiful English, and she turned her beautiful English into Yiddish idiom by taking the book to, Yiddish-speaking, English-speaking people and inserting the idiom into it. So there is a fakery in the book. I mean, it's not that she didn't grow up. She grew up in the Yiddish language, but she was a college graduate. She knew how to write English perfectly well and could and did write perfectly well. But it was the Yiddish idiom that she thought would sell the book, to Americans, that she wanted this to be the voice of an immigrant girl, and all of her stuff is written in that first, with the voice of the immigrant woman echoing through it.
I have a question. It didn't seem to me like there was that much Yiddish in the book, though. I mean, it was occasional. I mean, there was a lot of and there were.
It's hard to get, but it's like
anglicized. It's Yiddish idiom.
Word order would be the same word order that would sound natural in Yiddish, but doesn't quite in English.
Right.
Or just
because usually, like, Yiddish words were italicized in the text, and I felt like they were kind of actually few and far between. It wasn't the sort of thing where within 5 pages you're like, I'm having a hard time following this. You didn't.
No,
but she wanted people to read. It was like, in some ways brilliant to be able to somehow capture the spirit of that language in English.
Well, the phrases like "a black year on you," that's a Yiddish expression, which is translated, or the ground should open up and swallow you, right?
The doorman you mentioned, the doorman
right.
with Tsar, an officer in Tsar's army, just like the brass buttons, all sorts of...
Right. So, but it's true that you can read them. You don't have to understand anything about Yiddish to read them. They're just evocative phrases. But if you do, they're so much more colorful because they are the curses the Jews were raining on each other's heads.
Do you see it possible for any other ethnic group to write a book like this? We all heard about similar experiences and different groups going through the same thing. And I'm not familiar with other literature, but I'm just wondering.
So books from other immigrant communities
right.
that are like the...
Right.
That's a good...
And we have, the answer is yes, and we have many of them. And I'm sure you guys could all say some of them, but the ones that pop into my head are... In the same period, there were Italian novelists, men and women, and lasting much later, who used Italian idiom in their English novels. But do you?
Yeah, there are. I'm like trying to think of a few names, but there are some. I could probably just they're on my phone. When I get them, I can give them to you. But there are from the 1980s, 1970s Chinese immigrant books that I can share with you.
Maxine Hong Kingston, would you?
Yeah, and then there are a few about working class immigrants too. Maxine Hong Kingston definitely, but there are. I just can't remember names. Yeah, Girl in Translation, Lost in Translation, right? And then there's but there are a few more from the 70s that I'll give you.
Dragon Wings.
Yes, Dragon Wings, and there's a lot of kids' books. I just can't remember. Yeah, there's one in particular, Lisa C. from the Gold Mountains, and then there's one in particular about garment, somebody who lives in Chinatown, but I can't remember the name.
You have to send it to us, and then you'll have to put it on your shelves.
Yeah, I should have looked it up ahead of time.
Daughters of a Swan, 3 daughters of a Chinese
I'll think about it. It may come to me by the end of the...
What about, and this is crazy, I'm just thinking about this, but what about Americana, Adicie's book? I mean, there is some, it's a very different style of book, and she's an immigrant who goes back, but there are...
Well, and there's lots of books. Jhumpa Lahiri obviously writes a lot about the sort of both generations of immigrants. Junot Diaz, I think, is probably the best American writer, in my personal opinion, and sort of similarly talks about this sort of bifurcated identity. And so I think there's Anne uses language in amazing ways and footnotes in amazing ways. And, I would even say a writer like Salman Rushdie, when you read Midnight's Children, that opening passage jumped out at me because as a Hindi and Urdu speaker, it's in English, but you can tell it's somebody who speaks that other language as well, the way that it's written. And I think there's something really amazing about looking at language and that in the context of sort of immigrant literature writ large.
Oh, and also Akhil Sharma's book, the name. He was here for a Tenement talk. But check our Tenement talks, because we're always inviting people to this point. Yeah, family life. That's a good, excellent. Sarah, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm studying history, so I guess so much of what I think about is change over time. And we heard so much about sort of the similarities between Anzia's life and, lives of immigrants, some of you and people you know today. So I guess there's two ways my question works. One, I guess, would be, were there particular scenes that just were like, no, this would never happen now? And then the other way would be, is there a scene that would happen absolutely that would be in that book if it were written today?
Is there a scene that would happen that wouldn't happen now?
Right, a scene that stuck out as something that doesn't make sense now from the book, and then the vice versa.
Well, I mean, this is not central to the book, but the scene where the doctor comes in and sees the ailing mother and is like, she needs to get her foot amputated, and then leaves. Like, I think she'd probably be forced. She'd be taken to the hospital and forcibly had her foot amputated and not left to die of gangrene. Spoiler, but.
Another thing, and this is just random, but the opening scene, which you could even see if it was a movie, and you'd have the big shot of Sarah running out of the house, right? No one's bringing in money, and she's really worried about her family. And she's 10 years old, but she's gonna buy some herring and sell herring on the street in order to make a quarter. But that fire that she has to go out there and do that work. I mean, one of the things I think about all the time, being on Orchard Street, which was the center of the pushcart world, was that any new immigrant could arrive and just start selling things on the street. You didn't need a permit. You didn't need this. So there was the way in which certain jobs, I think, were available in New York and other cities right away that aren't as plentiful now as might have been before. I don't know.
So what about the court scene where the father goes to court and he's followed by the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and they all end up cheering him because the judge says, oh, yes, I respect your religion, and the light is shining from your eyes, and therefore, right, he'd been clapped into jail if he, and how did he ever get them, where did this fancy lawyer come from? Nobody has any money, so, there are scenes that.
I mean, I think the one about the different, I mean, I don't know, I guess it depends on what part of New York City you live in, but I feel like I still see that. I mean, I see the young kids, really, really young kids, maybe even as old as 10 years old, selling you candy chocolates on the train. You see even kids as young as 6 years old dancing in the train stations, or many vendors are not selling with permits because the city of New York, the way they set up their permit system, the bidding or even the limited number of permits, you force people to do things against the law because you don't give enough opportunities for everyone that needs it. So I feel like it's still the same. Even now, immigrants so I work in an organization where we serve refugees, asylees, and immigrants out in South Brooklyn. It's the largest Arab immigrant community in the city. And people come and they just, I don't know how and where and what, but they just figure it out. And when they get here, they're selling watches on the street. They already have a little street corner that they, so people will just do anything. And I feel like they would have said that 100 years ago. Same.
No, I think that spirit is there. Mm-hmm. What I was thinking about was that back then there were fewer laws about that. So like now you have the additional hurdle of trying to like, yeah, but absolutely. I had a question. Yeah, Jane.
Hi. I was wondering, it's a slightly different tangent, about Anzia's relationship with domesticity. And I know that she, in her own life, had not a shred of sort of domestic instinct or impulse and ran away from that. But the way she presents domesticity in her writing tells a different story. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
So, you know, she's trained as a home economist. She has nothing but contempt for the home, you know, all the efficiency and so on. She's writing in a period when home economics is just being developed as a field. I mean, it's both a way of holding women down and a way of providing women with some stature in their work. Because if their domestic work is scientific, then it has more status than if it's just whatever it is. So I think that what she does is, you know, when she describes domesticity in her books, it's always in a negative way, you know,
I was thinking about the story on Riverside Drive where the woman continues to cook.
Yes.
Even though she's supposed to go down to the building dining room.
Right.
And then goes down to the Lower East Side and bargains for a fish.
Right.
Like, that's where this, you know, her soul is, you know, replenished by those activities.
Yeah, no, I think that that's exactly right for that woman. But that woman still belongs on the Lower East Side. She's the old traditional. So for the new women, for the women like Anzia, for example, or for, I mean, she has stories about, you know, the young women who get trained to be maids in other people's houses. And they are funny. I mean, they're really funny because the idea that, you know, a mature woman does not know how to run her own kitchen and relies on a maid to do it is something that she completely mocks. You know, she just... I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, it's peripheral to what she does. It's like she takes a snipe at it whenever she can do it. But
Well, I was wondering in terms of Americanization.
Well, that's one of the ways, and that's actually interesting. So one of the ways in which middle-class women are trying to Americanize immigrant women in this 1900, 1910, 1920 period is to teach them domestic skills, and that's part of the home economics movement. But teaching them domestic skills in Anzia's, not only in her mind, but in her life, you know, she runs away from it. Teaching them domestic skills is really imprisoning them, putting them in the home, leaving them in the home, keeping them doing, you know, only what the husband, the patriarch, the children want them to do. So yes, I mean, you're right that it is an aspect in the culture, it's an aspect of Americanization, but it's an aspect that Yezierska, I think she rejects it whole cloth. I don't.
Yeah. I'm quite sensitive to the fact that we have students in the back who need to get home on time, right? And I wanted to end by thanking the panelists and thanking all of you, but especially I hope that you enjoy the rest of Bread Givers. And if you don't enjoy it, write about it. If you do enjoy it, write about it, and then we'll have you for a Tenement talk. So thank you, and thank you, Shazia.